December the 6th, 1941. At Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Pacific Fleet rested in formation so precise it resembled a parade ground. Battleships moored along Ford Island reflected in the still water, their hull numbers glowing under dim pier lights. The air was heavy with the smell of oil, salt, and paint. Maintenance crews finished their shifts, cranes stood motionless, and the sound of night meant only the rhythmic slap of waves against steel. Admiral Husband Edward Kimmel sat at his desk inside the Macalapa headquarters. The clock on the wall read 21:10. A final dispatch from Washington had arrived earlier in the day, a routine intelligence summary, noting increased Japanese diplomatic traffic and indications of potential hostility. Nothing in the message specified a location. No orders to change alert level followed. He initialed it, placed it in the outbox, and continued with the evening reports. He had commanded the Pacific Fleet for 10 months. His appointment in February had followed the controversial removal of Admiral Richardson, who opposed the stationing of the fleet in Hawaii. Kimmel, pragmatic and procedural, accepted the post with quiet precision. His approach to command was not instinct, but structure. Briefings at exact times, detailed patrol charts, readiness evaluations updated every 48 hours. He was the Navy's model of controlled efficiency, a man for whom preparation was a matter of arithmetic, not emotion. That night, the arithmetic seemed sound. The fleet was intact, supply lines were stable, Pacific patrols showed no unusual movement. Intelligence pointed toward possible Japanese activity near Southeast Asia, not Hawaii. The Army's radar training continued on schedule, with operational hours set for early morning and shut down before 0800. Anti-aircraft ammunition remained locked in depots, standard peacetime protocol. The harbor's ships sat in double rows, convenient for maintenance, catastrophic for defense. Outside, the island seemed far from war. Honolulu's streets were lit for the weekend. Soldiers and sailors filled bars on Hotel Street. At Hickam Field, music drifted from open hangar doors, a small band rehearsing Christmas songs. The Navy Yard slowed to half-staff after 1800. Lights were dimmed to save fuel. The mood was routine. At 2200, a junior intelligence officer entered Kimmel's office with a summary from the Navy Department's Communication Division. It mentioned an intercepted Japanese message ordering the destruction of certain codebooks and files in embassies abroad. The signal's meaning was clear to analysts in Washington. War was imminent. But that conclusion was not passed to Hawaii. Kimmel's copy carried no comment. He read it, nodded once, and filed it under routine. In his private logbook that night, he wrote a single sentence. No major hostile action anticipated at present. Continue standard readiness level. Across the ocean, unseen and unheard, Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku and Zuikaku, advanced through the North Pacific. The task force carried 353 aircraft and a single instruction: attack the U.S. Pacific Fleet at anchor. Their radio silence was absolute. The operations commander, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, had received word that diplomatic negotiations in Washington were ending without progress. The time for attack was set. On Oahu, the night air was humid. Palm trees swayed lightly under the trade wind. From the observation post at Opana, a radar station high on the northern ridge, technicians performed final calibrations on the SCR-270 unit before shutdown. At 2300, they logged no unusual contacts. The island slept. At Hickam Field, aircraft stood in neat lines, propellers covered, wings close together to make guarding them easier. Fuel trucks were parked beside them. Pilots had weekend passes. The base commander had ordered ammunition to remain locked. At Ford Island, USS Arizona's crew settled into quarters. Its captain, Franklin Van Valkenburg, reviewed minor maintenance notes, a valve replacement, a signal light repair, and an issue with an electrical circuit. He wrote one final line before lights out. Engineering, satisfactory. Farther west, USS Nevada's searchlights swept across the channel once, then dimmed. In the quiet of the moorings, sailors played cards or read by flashlight. No one expected movement until Monday. Kimmel's adjutant left the headquarters just after midnight. The Admiral remained seated, rereading the Pacific Fleet's disposition chart. He noted the absence of the aircraft carriers Enterprise and Lexington, both at sea delivering aircraft to Wake and Midway. Their absence concerned him, but not for the reason history would later record. He simply disliked losing visual command over his most valuable ships. At 0030, he closed the folder, stood, and looked out through the blinds. The harbour was still lit by scattered work lamps. He saw the outlines of West Virginia, Tennessee, and Oklahoma, stationary in perfect line. The arrangement pleased him, symmetrical, ordered. It represented control. When he finally left for quarters near the submarine base, he carried no sense of urgency. The last entry in his night report read, "Fleet morale steady, readiness satisfactory." At that same hour, 220 miles north of Oahu, Nagumo's strike force adjusted course to 180 degrees south. The first wave crews were already climbing into cockpits. They reviewed target maps, fuel ratios, and radio codes. At 0400, their flight leaders would begin warming engines. None of this information reached Pearl Harbor. Washington's final warning, sent at 07:33 a.m. Eastern Time, hostile action possible at any moment, was transmitted too late to be decoded before the first bombs fell. At dawn, the island glowed under a clear sky. The radar units on Oahu came online for their daily training sweep at 0400. At 0702, two operators detected an unusually large formation approaching from the north. The duty officer on the mainland phone line told them not to worry. It's probably the B-17s expected from California. They logged the contact and shut down the radar. By 0740, the Japanese formation descended through scattered clouds. The first torpedo planes broke formation over Kaina Point. The second group leveled out for their run on Ford Island. The third climbed to 3,000 meters, preparing to dive. On shore, flag duty began at 0745 sharp. The band assembled on USS Nevada's deck to play the morning colors. The first notes of the national anthem had barely started when the sky above the harbor filled with engines. And then the first bomb fell. Хочешь, чтобы я продолжила? Chapter 2. The Command and the Collapse. Где начинается сам удар. 7:48 to 9:45. Хронология. Решение штаба Kimmela. Действия флота. Потери. Структура связи. Все в одном дыхании. Аналитично и документально. December 7th, 1941. 7:48. The first explosion was so sharp it silenced the harbour for a second. Sailors looked up instinctively, expecting an accident at the Navy Yard. Then came the second, heavier, followed by the mechanical scream of dive bombers breaking cloud. Within 10 seconds, routine ended. From Ford Island to Hickam Field, the Pacific Fleet, 86 ships, 390 aircraft, and 36,000 personnel, was at peacetime readiness. Ammunition was locked. Fuel hoses were still connected. Engines were cold. On the piers, sentries had no orders for air defense because no one expected war on a Sunday morning. The first Japanese wave had 183 aircraft, 40 torpedo bombers, 51 dive bombers, 49 high-level bombers, and 43 fighters. They struck from the north, descending out of the rising sun. Their targets were predetermined: battleships first, then airfields, then fuel and maintenance depots. At 0749, USS Oklahoma took 3 torpedoes to port within 90 seconds. The ship heeled, rolled, and capsized with hundreds trapped inside. At 0755, USS Arizona's forward magazine was hit by an armor-piercing bomb dropped from 10,000 feet. The detonation split the ship in half and consumed her crew in a single flash. Smoke and fragments shot 600 feet into the air. In the Macalapa Command Building, Admiral Kimmel stood at the window facing the harbour. The first he saw of the attack was a formation of aircraft crossing low over the oil tanks. He thought they were American until he noticed the red circles under the wings. An aide burst through the door shouting, "Air raid on Pearl Harbor! This is not a drill!" The sentence had never been used before. Kimmel turned once, ordered the base to general quarters, and moved toward the operations room. The lights flickered from shock waves. Outside, black columns rose from the channel, fire spreading across the oil slicks. Communication lines jammed immediately. The interbase phones overloaded. Radio operators switched to emergency frequencies. At 0800, Kimmel ordered all ships to sortie. Get underway if possible. Only one battleship, USS Nevada, managed to raise steam and move from berth. She became a moving target. At 0803, bombs bracketed her path. The captain grounded the ship intentionally to avoid blocking the channel. Air defense guns opened fire independently. The Army's 3-inch batteries at Fort Kamehameha engaged targets visually, firing without radar coordination. At 08:12, USS Helena's gunners scored one of the first confirmed kills, downing a torpedo bomber over the channel, but the sky was already full of burning metal and falling debris. Kimmel's operations board filled with red markers, 1 per reported hit. Within 20 minutes, there were too many to place. Reports came in without structure. Arizona lost. Oklahoma capsized. Nevada moving. Dry dock hit. Airfields burning. The Admiral listened, silent, calculating what could be saved. His staff waited for orders that didn't come. At 08:25, he said only, "Continue firing. Get the fuel shut off. Damage control priority 1. At Hickam Field, 40 miles away, the situation was worse. Most aircraft were lined wing to wing to prevent sabotage. Bombs fell directly on the rows of P-40s and B-17s. Hangars collapsed, fuel trucks exploded, and mechanics tried to fight fires with sand. The base commander, Colonel L.W. Moore, ordered any pilot able to fly to take off. Only 4 fighters left the ground. 2 were shot down within minutes. By 8:40, the second wave arrived, 171 aircraft. This group targeted cruisers and naval facilities. USS Shore exploded in dry dock, her forward section tearing away in a fireball. USS Pennsylvania, Cassin, and Downs were hit while still on blocks. Dockyard workers ran bucket lines amid burning oil. Inside the command center, air grew thick with smoke. Communications to Washington were sporadic. Messages queued, delayed by static. The Navy Department received Kimmel's first signal at 8:58. Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is no drill. The message arrived in Washington at 13:06 Eastern Time. It was the first confirmation that war had begun. At 09:10, the attack began to subside. The Japanese had achieved total surprise. Out of the 8 battleships, 4 were sunk, 3 severely damaged, and 1, USS Pennsylvania, partially operational. The fleet's fuel reserves, dry docks, and submarine base remained mostly intact, but the core of America's naval deterrent had been eliminated in under 2 hours. Kimmel left the operations room briefly and stepped outside. He watched as the Arizona burned, the fire fed by oil slicks spreading across the water. Men clung to debris, calling for help. Tugboats moved through the wreckage, spraying foam and pulling survivors from the water. He stood motionless until one of his aides urged him back inside. A moment later, a fragment of metal, likely from an anti-aircraft shell, struck the headquarters wall beside him. A small piece ricocheted and hit him in the chest, cutting through his uniform but not breaking skin. He looked down at it, then placed it on his desk without comment. At 09:45, the last Japanese aircraft turned north, leaving behind a harbour transformed into a graveyard. Smoke obscured the mountains. The sound of secondary explosions continued for hours as fuel burned. The final count by noon, 2,403 dead, 1,178 wounded, 188 US aircraft destroyed, 8 battleships sunk or damaged, 11 other vessels hit. Japan lost only 29 aircraft. By midday, Admiral Kimmel began the process of recovery. He ordered divers to assess the wrecks, fuel lines to be sealed, and all remaining vessels to be ready for possible second strikes. The carrier task forces, Enterprise and Lexington, were still at sea, unscathed, and now the Pacific Fleet's only offensive strength. When night fell, the harbour glowed red with burning oil. Floodlights cut through smoke as rescue operations continued. Inside headquarters, telegraph operators sent continuous reports. Names, hull numbers, estimates. Each was logged under a new column labelled Lost. Kimmel signed the final report at 23:55. His signature was small, precise, unshaken. He did not sleep. The next day, Washington would call for explanations, but by then his command had already failed. December 8, 1941. The fires at Pearl Harbor were still burning when the first investigative telegram arrived from Washington. The tone was direct. Provide immediate assessment of readiness conditions prior to attack. State measures taken to anticipate hostilities. It was not a request for information. It was a demand for accountability. By that morning, the harbour looked like a mechanical graveyard. The Arizona still smoked, her hull split open. The Oklahoma lay overturned with rescue crews cutting through her belly to reach trapped sailors. The water shimmered with a film of fuel, rainbow against black. The scent of oil and burned metal hung over the island. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel began compiling data the way he always had, methodically, by category: ship damage, air loss, personnel, communications. He listed everything in black ink, his handwriting steady and exact. He recorded the hour each event began, the actions taken, and the names of officers in command at each station. He worked without pause for 12 hours, refusing to speak to the press or to his subordinates about blame. The first formal dispatch from the Navy Department reached him at 1800 that day. The United States was now at war with Japan. Orders followed immediately to prepare the remaining vessels for action, but the underlying message between lines was clear: the failure would be examined. In Washington, President Roosevelt had already addressed Congress, declaring December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Behind the speech, the Navy's senior command had convened in closed session. The Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Harold Stark, and Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, debated whether Kimmel and his Army counterpart, Lieutenant General Walter Short, should remain in command during the coming months of retaliation. The conclusion was procedural. Command accountability required visible action. A commander's duty, they reasoned, was not only to fight, but to foresee. Meanwhile, at Pearl Harbor, the physical evidence of unpreparedness was impossible to ignore. Kimmel's staff compiled the following assessment, submitted on December 10th. Radar picket stations had operated only from 400 to 700 hours. Ammunition for anti-aircraft batteries was secured under lock. Keys were held by ordnance officers off-site. No air patrols had been launched before 7:30 due to routine Sunday scheduling. All aircraft had been parked close together for sabotage protection, making them vulnerable to bombing. Intelligence messages referencing possible Japanese movement towards Southeast Asia had been received but not evaluated as direct threats to Hawaii. These facts would later appear almost word for word in the Roberts Commission report, the first official inquiry into the disaster. The commission, headed by Supreme Court Justice Owen J. Roberts, arrived in Honolulu on December 18th. Its brief was to determine whether commanding officers had fulfilled their duties in anticipating and preventing the attack. Over the next 2 weeks, the commission interviewed 127 witnesses, sailors, radar operators, airfield officers, and intelligence staff. Each testified in formal naval style, short answers, no speculation. Kimmel was summoned on December 20th. He entered the room in full uniform, his posture straight, despite the exhaustion of 2 weeks without real sleep. The record of his testimony remains one of the most studied documents of the war. When asked whether he believed the fleet had been ready, Kimmel replied, "The readiness was consistent with the information available. No specific warning of attack on Hawaii was received." When asked about radar reports, they were interpreted as friendly aircraft. That was consistent with prior schedules. And when asked whether he had considered dispersing the fleet, yes, but not without higher authority. Such movement would have required political clearance from the Navy Department. His answers were precise, professional, and ultimately damning. The transcript showed no panic, no excuses, only procedure. The Roberts Commission concluded its findings on January 23, 1942. Its language was careful but decisive. The commanders at Pearl Harbor, Admiral Kimmel and General Short, failed to discharge their duties with the judgment that the occasion required. They did not maintain adequate readiness against attack. The report did not accuse them of dereliction, a criminal charge, but of errors of judgment. That distinction ended Kimmel's career, but preserved his honor in the narrowest technical sense. The Navy acted within hours. On December 17th, before the commission had even finished, Kimmel was relieved of command. His orders were read aloud at Makalapa headquarters. He saluted, turned the post over to Admiral Chester Nimitz, and left the building without ceremony. Outside, sailors stood at attention as he passed. One shouted, "It wasn't your fault, sir." Kimmel did not respond. He returned to the mainland aboard a transport ship under escort. The newspapers had already written the verdict before the official one was released. Headlines read, "Fleet caught sleeping, commanders to blame." Photographs of burning battleships ran beside portraits of Kimmel and Short. Editorials called for courts-martial. Washington, however, avoided a trial. The Navy's leadership feared that an open hearing might expose classified intelligence operations, particularly the magic decrypts of Japanese diplomatic codes. Those decrypts, some historians would later prove, contained enough clues to indicate imminent war, though not the exact location. But they had been restricted to a small circle of officials in Washington, and Kimmel was never among them. He requested a formal court-martial 3 times. Each time, the request was denied, in the interests of national unity. By March 1942, he was retired to civilian status, his rank reduced automatically from 4-star Admiral to 2-star Rear Admiral, standard practice upon retirement, but interpreted publicly as punishment. In his private correspondence, Kimmel never admitted guilt but never denied responsibility. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "I am the man who happened to be there when the sky fell. I will bear it as my duty, though not my fault." He settled in Groton, Connecticut, away from press and politics. He avoided interviews, but continued writing detailed memoranda about communications between Washington and Honolulu in late 1941. His personal archive would later exceed 3,000 pages, cross-referenced signals, dates, and procedural notes intended to prove that the decisive warnings never reached his command. The record showed he was right, but history had already moved on. In the decades after the war, multiple commissions revisited the question. The Navy's 1946 Hewitt inquiry confirmed that key intelligence had been withheld. A 1995 Senate resolution formally stated that Kimmel's judgment was based on incomplete and inaccurate information provided by Washington. But no administration restored his rank. For historians, his legacy remains the case study of modern command failure, not of cowardice, but of bureaucracy. He was a professional who followed every rule precisely in a war that punished precision when divorced from imagination. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who replaced him, later said privately, "It was not that Kimmel did too little, it was that he could not know enough." The phrase remains the most accurate verdict ever given. 1942 to 1946. The war advanced westward across the Pacific, while one man remained frozen at its point of origin. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, the former Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, lived quietly in Groton, Connecticut, in a rented colonial house 3 miles from the naval base, where he had once inspected new destroyers. The newspapers no longer printed his name, but the Navy still kept his file marked under review. His days followed a pattern. Morning coffee at 06:30, reading dispatch summaries from the Associated Press, a walk through the harbour, and hours spent at a wooden desk reviewing documents that few would ever read. On the surface, it looked like retirement. In reality, it was a long audit of failure. He catalogued every cable he had received between November 27th and December 7th, 1941, 129 in total. He charted how each had moved through the bureaucracy of the Navy Department: time of transmission, routing officer, decoding station, arrival time in Honolulu. His conclusion was empirical and unemotional. Vital intelligence had been delayed or withheld. Among the withheld data were the Japanese 14-part message and the WWII's execute order, signals that Washington had decrypted but never relayed to the fleet. These messages revealed the diplomatic break between Japan and the United States and suggested imminent hostilities. Yet, by the time Pearl Harbor decoded its copy, the attack had already ended. In 1942, as American forces fought at Midway and Guadalcanal, Kimmel submitted a 268-page memorandum titled Sequence of Communications Bearing on Pearl Harbor Attack. It was a technical document, not an appeal. He did not argue emotion. He presented time, distance, frequency, and transmission speed, the mathematics of miscommunication. The Navy acknowledged receipt and archived it without comment. He did not send another. Publicly, Kimmel's name became shorthand for disaster. Naval recruits studying fleet organization learned of Kimmel and Short as a single phrase, a case example of unpreparedness. In training manuals and wartime newsreels, the destruction at Pearl Harbor was attributed to complacency at the local command level. Few questioned whether that simplification served political ends. Privately, within the Navy, opinions diverged. Officers who had served under Kimmel described him as exacting but fair, a man who believed too deeply in orders. Chester Nimitz, his successor, inherited the burned fleet and rebuilt it into the instrument that would reach Tokyo Bay. When asked later about Kimmel, Nimitz refused to condemn him. "He was my friend. He bore a burden that was not his alone." Still, official silence persisted. The war needed unity, not debate. The doctrine of responsibility at the top left no room for nuance. In 1946, after the war's end, the Joint Congressional Committee on the Investigation of the Pearl Harbor attack reopened the case. Kimmel testified, again now in a grey civilian suit instead of uniform. The hall was packed with journalists. He read from prepared notes for 5 hours. His central point never changed. "Had I been furnished with the complete intelligence available in Washington, the fleet would have been in a different posture of readiness." He backed the statement with precise data, timelines, intercepted communications, the dates when Japanese carriers had vanished from normal reconnaissance routes. Several senators pressed him. Would any reasonable commander have expected an attack at Pearl Harbor? Kimmel paused. With the full picture, yes. Without it, no commander could have imagined it. His calm tone contrasted with the mood of the chamber. The transcripts show moments of unease, silence, paper shuffling, no further questions. When the hearings concluded, the committee issued a divided verdict. The Democratic majority upheld the original conclusion of errors of judgment. The Republican minority argued that intelligence failures in Washington bore equal, if not greater, responsibility. The divide became political. Kimmel left the chamber slowly, declining all interviews. Over the next 2 decades, he lived as a man half erased from his profession. The Navy never invited him to reunions or official commemorations. His pension was standard. His correspondence went unanswered. He continued to write analyses for naval journals under initials only, HEK. Articles on logistics, chain of command structures, and radar coordination. They were technical, dispassionate, but unmistakably personal. His son, Edward Kimmel Jr., entered the Navy in 1945 and rose to the rank of Rear Admiral. That quiet continuity, father to son, became his only public vindication. By the 1950s, Kimmel's story had faded from public consciousness, replaced by new wars in Korea and Cold War anxiety. But among officers who studied command theory, Pearl Harbor remained a foundational case study. It taught that no amount of discipline could compensate for missing intelligence, and no system could function when information was compartmentalized by fear of leaks. 1961. 2 decades after the attack, Kimmel attended a veterans memorial in Washington. An old acquaintance, now an admiral, approached him and said quietly, "You know, the files show you were right." Kimmel's reply was simple. It changes nothing. He died 7 years later, on May 14, 1968, aged 86. There was no official attendance from the Navy. The flag on his coffin bore no Admiral's 4 stars, only 2. In the decades that followed, historians revisited his record repeatedly. In 1995, the Senate passed a resolution recognizing that Admiral Kimmel and General Short had been denied critical intelligence and should be posthumously restored to their full ranks. The Department of Defense, citing policy precedent, declined to implement it. As of today, the recommendation still stands, unresolved, filed under pending administrative review. For historians, Kimmel's story defines the transition between 2 worlds: the 20th century Navy of battleships, bureaucracy, and chain of command, and the modern world of real-time intelligence, signals, and speed. He failed not because he ignored the threat, but because the system he served did not permit him to see it in time. He trusted hierarchy in a moment that required intuition. Every major naval command school in the United States still studies the attack on Pearl Harbor through two perspectives: Japanese operational brilliance and American systemic blindness. Both lead inevitably to the same name. In that, Kimmel's burden became his legacy. He showed that even perfect obedience can lead to catastrophe if the information above it is flawed. Washington, 1941. The structure of the United States Pacific Defense was, on paper, efficient. It was divided between two commands: the Navy, responsible for the fleet, and the Army, responsible for the airfields and coastal defense of Oahu. Both answered not to each other, but directly to the War and Navy departments in Washington, 7,000 kilometers away. In theory, this prevented overlap. In practice, it created silence. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel controlled ships, submarines, and naval aviation. General Walter Short controlled interceptors, radar, and anti-aircraft artillery. Neither had authority to issue joint alerts without approval from Washington. The result was a command structure in which every warning travelled upward before it could move sideways. By late November 1941, the flow of intelligence between those layers was inconsistent at best. The Navy Department had divided its code-breaking sections into compartments, each known only by letter designations. The most secret, OP-20G, handled the magic decrypts, intercepted Japanese diplomatic communications decoded on machines locked behind two doors in a secured room at the main Navy building. Only a handful of officers, including Admiral Stark and Secretary Knox, had access. Neither Kimmel nor Short were on the distribution list. That decision, made in 1940 to minimize leaks, became the first link in the chain of failure. Between November 27th and December 6th, Washington transmitted more than a dozen general warnings to its overseas commands. The message most often cited in later investigations arrived at Pearl Harbor on November 27th. It read, "This dispatch is to be considered a war warning. Negotiations with Japan have ceased. Hostile action possible at any moment. Execute appropriate defensive deployments." To Kimmel, the message was significant but non-specific. It contained no coordinates, no time frame, and no mention of Hawaii. It referenced Southeast Asia or the Philippines as potential targets, consistent with previous intelligence assessments. Based on that wording, Kimmel ordered the fleet to prepare for possible sabotage, not large-scale air attack. Ships were kept close together for easier guard duty. Aircraft were parked in tight rows to prevent infiltration by ground agents. Every decision was logical, based on what was known. Every one would prove fatal. The Army's version of the same message reached General Short 6 hours later. He interpreted defensive deployment to mean protection from sabotage as well, and ordered his aircraft grouped together. No clarification was requested from Washington, and none was sent. Each commander believed he had done his duty. The system rewarded caution, not imagination. In the week before the attack, radio intelligence stations from Guam to California tracked increasing Japanese naval activity. By December 3rd, reports noted that Japanese merchant vessels had gone silent on all frequencies, a standard pre-war indicator. The Navy's communication analysts recognized the pattern, but did not issue an immediate alarm. The decision to alert Pacific commands was debated in Washington and postponed pending confirmation. Meanwhile, Japanese carrier signals vanished completely on December 5th. Analysts in the Office of Naval Intelligence concluded that the carriers had either changed frequencies or moved into weather conditions that made tracking difficult. No one suggested they were heading for Hawaii. At the same time, diplomatic decrypts, known as the 14-part message, revealed that Japan would soon sever negotiations. The final portion of that message was decoded in Washington on December 7th at 0900 Eastern Time, corresponding to 0330 in Hawaii, barely an hour before the first bomb fell. The alert cable sent to Kimmel and Short reached Honolulu after 11 local time. The attack had been underway for over 3 hours. No single officer was negligent. The system simply moved too slowly. At the root of the problem was an outdated command doctrine built around 19th century communications. Orders moved through formal channels, coded, typed, transmitted, decoded, logged, and forwarded. Each step required authorization. Each delay compounded the next. Even at its best, a full cycle of message approval between Washington and Honolulu could take up to 6 hours. The design reflected a world where fleets moved at 20 knots and wars were fought on timetables. But by 1941, war moved at 300 miles per hour, the speed of a Zero fighter. The structure had not caught up to the technology it was supposed to command. The radar network on Oahu was another example. 6 stations operated in training mode only. Their output fed into a single information center at Fort Shafter, staffed by 6 men, none of whom had authority to issue alerts without Army confirmation. When radar detected the incoming Japanese formation at 0702, the observer followed procedure. He reported the contact. The officer in charge followed procedure as well. He logged it and did nothing further. The system worked exactly as designed. It just wasn't designed for war. Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, later told investigators, "We believed Hawaii was too distant, too fortified, and too obvious a target. An attack there would have been considered strategically reckless." The assumption was widespread. The War Plans Division's own 1941 estimate placed the likelihood of attack on Hawaii at less than 1 in 100. Resources were focused on the Philippines and the British territories in Asia. That strategic model blinded decision-makers to the possibility of a high-risk, high-reward strike. Exactly the kind of operation Japan would choose. Internal memoranda from the Office of Naval Intelligence show that Hawaii was not on the critical list for surveillance. No priority patrol routes covered the Northern Pacific. The gap, 600 miles wide, became the corridor through which the Japanese strike force advanced undetected. When questioned after the war, Stark admitted, "We underestimated both Japan's capability and her boldness. The system did not fail one man. It failed collectively." The shock of Pearl Harbor forced the United States military to dismantle that system entirely. Within 2 years, command structures were redesigned around unified commands, joint operations where Army, Navy, and Air Forces reported to a single theatre commander with full authority. Intelligence was centralized under the newly formed Office of Strategic Services, which evolved into the Central Intelligence Agency after the war. Communications protocols were rewritten. Secure direct channels between Washington and major commands were established. The practice of distributing only partial intelligence to field commanders ended. The lesson was simple. Compartmentalization might protect secrets, but it destroys awareness. By 1943, the US Navy had instituted a principle known as real-time command synchronization, the idea that information must move faster than the enemy. The radio, once treated as an administrative tool, became the primary weapon of control. Looking back from modern standards, the failure of December 7th was not a failure of courage or will, but of architecture. The United States had built a command network optimized for deliberation in a world that suddenly required instant reaction. Kimmel's fate, in this context, was inevitable. He was the last admiral of the old Navy, the paper Navy, trained to obey, verify, and wait for confirmation. When events demanded anticipation, he had only authorization procedures. When intuition was needed, he had a signal queue. The war buried that kind of command culture forever. Every major American war since, from Korea to Iraq, has carried a trace of Pearl Harbor's lessons. Unified command, instant communication, shared intelligence. The architecture of modern defense is, in part, a monument to that single morning's breakdown. Historians now describe Pearl Harbor not as a surprise attack, but as an intelligence compression failure. Too many warnings filtered through too many hands. In that sense, the system itself became the battlefield, and it lost before the first bomb fell. The human cost of that failure lay not only in the 2,403 dead, but in one man who carried the record of every message, every delay, and every signature that preceded them. For Kimmel, the silence from Washington in those final hours was not just operational, it was personal. A void between faith in order and the reality of chaos. And when he later said, "I am the man who happened to be there when the sky fell," it was not an excuse, it was a diagnosis. Washington, D.C., 1947. The war was over, but the paperwork was not. The last of the Pearl Harbor inquiries, the Joint Congressional Committee's final report, lay stacked in the Library of Congress archives. 12 volumes, 8,000 pages. Its language was legal, its conclusion restrained. Responsibility for the failure to anticipate and prevent the attack must be shared by the highest authorities in Washington and by local commanders in Hawaii. For the first time, the record acknowledged that the system, not only the men, had failed. But the men were still the ones who carried its weight. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel read that line at his home in Connecticut, sitting beside a worn globe he kept from his Navy office. He marked the date in the margin, folded the page, and closed the book. There was no vindication, only finality. The United States had already moved on to new enemies, new oceans, and a new doctrine born directly from the shock he had lived through. Between 1942 and 1947, the American military had rewritten itself. The National Security Act of 1947 created a unified Department of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the National Security Council. Where Kimmel and Short once operated in isolation, future commanders would share intelligence in real time. The idea of compartmented silence, the bureaucratic pride of pre-war Washington, was abandoned. The Office of Naval Intelligence, which had once kept its decrypts locked behind layered clearances, was restructured under the Centralized Armed Forces Security Agency, later the NSA. Its core principle was the one written in post-war memoranda. Information must move faster than events. The same logic shaped the Navy's transformation. The fleet that had once relied on slow, deliberate communication now operated through continuous signal networks, encrypted radio, radar linkage, later satellite relay. Command posts that had once waited for approval now functioned as autonomous units trained to act immediately on verified intelligence. In the Pacific, the doctrine was summarized in 3 words that became naval dogma: don't wait, confirm. Kimmel's failure had become the Navy's permanent correction. Pearl Harbor also transformed American strategy. Before 1941, the United States had been a continental power that thought of oceans as protection. After Pearl Harbor, the oceans became front lines. The Navy's entire philosophy shifted from deterrence through presence to deterrence through motion. Static fleets were considered liabilities. Mobility, dispersion, and constant patrol became sacred principles. Carrier aviation replaced the battleship as the core of naval doctrine. The irony was complete. The very vessels absent from Pearl Harbor, Enterprise and Lexington, became the symbols of the war's new era. Their survival, by accident of timing, proved what Kimmel could never demonstrate through theory: that ships at sea are safer than ships at anchor, and that deterrence means nothing without visibility beyond the horizon. In post-war America, the phrase Pearl Harbor became more than a date. It became a metaphor for warning ignored, vigilance abandoned, and the cost of delay. Every subsequent generation of officers studied it not as tragedy, but as curriculum. At the Naval War College in Newport, the Pearl Harbor case study entered the mandatory syllabus in 1952. The lessons were broken into categories: intelligence flow and command responsibility, risk communication under ambiguity, operational posture versus political restraint. Each lecture ended with a single sentence written in white chalk on blackboards across classrooms: there are no rear areas anymore. For the officers who had grown up in the nuclear age, the lesson was existential. In an era when a single missile could reach the homeland in minutes, the distance that had protected Hawaii in 1941 no longer existed. By the late 20th century, revisionist historians began re-examining Kimmel's record. The declassification of wartime decrypts in the 1970s revealed the full extent of Washington's information advantage before the attack. Documents showed that intelligence summaries containing critical warnings had circulated among at least 30 officers in the capital, but none reached Honolulu. Public opinion began to shift. In 1995, Congress passed Senate Resolution 107, that the final responsibility for the defense of Pearl Harbor rests with the government of the United States, and that Admiral Kimmel and General Short performed their duties to the best of their ability, with the information they were provided. The resolution was symbolic. The Department of Defense declined to act on its recommendation to restore Kimmel's rank. Yet, within the Navy, sentiment changed. Modern officers began to speak of him not as a failure, but as the last casualty of an obsolete system. In 2010, the Navy formally named a new intelligence building at the National Maritime Intelligence Center in his honor, unofficially, but pointedly. Inside, a small plaque carries the inscription, "He commanded with integrity in a time when information did not keep pace with duty." Military historians often describe Pearl Harbor as a moment when time itself shifted. The hours it took to decode, route, and approve a message in 1941 became the standard against which all modern command systems are measured. Today's global defense networks operate on data that travels in milliseconds, and yet the ethical core remains the same. Responsibility flows upward, but reaction must begin below. In modern naval academies, instructors still reference Kimmel when discussing operational command limits. They call it the Kimmel paradox. The commander held accountable for information he never received. It remains unresolved, because the principle of command requires that someone always bears the weight, even for unseen errors. That paradox keeps the chain of command human, fallible, and moral. At Pearl Harbor, the memorial stands above the sunken Arizona. The names of 1,177 sailors are etched into white marble. Among them, in smaller script near the visitor wall, are the names of the fleet's commanding officers, listed without rank, only title. The plaque does not assign blame. It simply records Pacific Fleet, December 7, 1941. Command, Admiral H.E. Kimmel. Visitors read it in silence, not with anger, but with recognition. For most, the meaning is clear. Even perfection in discipline cannot prevent catastrophe in confusion. Each year, on the anniversary of the attack, the Navy's senior officers gather above the harbour. They read from the logs of the day, moment by moment, minute by minute. And at 07:55, when the first explosion is read aloud, the order is given, all stations observe silence. For 1 full minute, nothing moves. No ship, no voice, no engine. It is the sound of every lesson that war ever taught. Kimmel's story ends not in vindication but in continuity. His career marked the dividing line between 2 centuries of command, the slow world of telegraphs and the instantaneous world of information. He represented faith in procedure. History demanded faith in anticipation. The Navy that replaced him still carries his shadow in every protocol and every exercise that begins with the phrase, "Report immediately any unusual contact." Pearl Harbor redefined the measure of time in war, from hours to seconds. And within that transformation lies the reason his name endures, because the world learned at his expense that in war, delay is defeat.